So today on the channel, we're going to be taking a look at the SomoGear PEQ15. So if you're looking for more of a review about how these perform from a IR output level, IR illuminator, how they hold zero, that sort of thing, take a look at some of the reviews done by BrassFacts, 4MR Ranch, and a couple of others. There's plenty of reviews out there. We'll be covering mostly in this video is going to be my experience with the SomoGear PEQ15 as well as a couple of others. We obviously have a couple of examples, some disassembled in front of us, and just my general takeaways after taking a look and a deep dive into each of these different units. So I'll walk you through what we have on the bench here, and I'll timestamp the video so that you can jump to the different chapters for what's applicable to you. This complete unit right here is a newer version or the latest version of the SomoGear PEQ15. This is the non-potted version, so this runs you about 75 bucks. We'll come back to this comparison when we're talking about the housing, but otherwise fit, form, and function, pretty much identical to the rest. This top unit up here, this is going to be the non-potted SomoGear PEQ15. And then this bottom unit here is the potted full power variant of the PEQ15. And then behind the units, I have a couple of different accessories that you can get from SomoGear. We'll talk about these as well. And so now we're just gonna take a look at the non-potted PEQ15. So the first topic I'm gonna cover is disassembly of the unit. So disassembly is actually pretty easy, not too complicated. We'll kind of half put this back together. More or less kind of goes like this. So as you can see here, I drilled out these different screws here, and the drill bit that I used was either one of these two, was a 13/64 or a 3/16 drill bit. And so as you can see there, it fits very nicely into that hole, and that allows you to just remove a little bit of the epoxy off the top. Don't go too crazy, you can end up hitting one of the screws. For the non-potted PEQ15, they used Phillips head screws, and I believe the thread pitch is M3. Should be an M3 by 8 if you need to buy replacement screws. So keeping that in mind that there's Phillips heads in here, we don't want to go too crazy. And then I was able to just grab a screwdriver here, jam it in there, unscrew it. And one thing of note in the back here, this is a bit of a deeper pocket, so I used some picks to pull the epoxy plug out of there. But these ones here and here are fairly shallow, so you'll be able to get to them pretty quickly. Same with the screw up front. And once you take, the screw up front is a Allen head, so keep that in mind. I believe the size is 5/64. For that front one, I was able to remove a little bit of the material with this drill bit, and then I followed up with a 5/64, which fits nicely inside of the head of that Allen. That way you don't strip out the actual hex. So I actually prefer that if you are trying to disassemble it, and it makes it a lot easier. Also, I needed to remove the thumb screw here in order to gain access to this bolt, so all I did was just back it out. It did end up destroying the housing, but obviously this housing was already cracked, so I wasn't too worried about that. I was able to just grab a putty knife and pry this thing apart. So next, I want to talk about the failure mode of this particular unit. There were two failure modes on this unit, and I'll tell you my thoughts in a second here. But basically, the first failure mode, the major failure mode, was that when I was tightening this unit down, it ended up cracking the housing. And so where did it crack? It cracked on the housing here along this claw. And so basically it rendered the unit inoperable. It would never hold zero ever again and would just continue to deteriorate and continue to crack. Since obviously I've removed it, I was able to just glue this section back together. We'll talk about some modifications and repairs that we're going to make to this, and see if we can get this thing to back up and running. The second failure mode for this particular unit was that the crane plug ended up having this little red wire break off, and that allowed the crane plug to basically rotate inside. And as you can see, there's very, very little glue in here. It doesn't surprise me that it ended up breaking off. Also on disassembly, I noticed that there was almost little to no adhesive along the edges here. So this is definitely not a waterproof system. So just keep that in mind. Water ingress can definitely happen with one of these units. So now we can take a little bit of a look at the internal workings of this unit and figure out how it works. So you've got the control board here. That directly connects to your mode selector, as well as your push button. And then those are just wired up to these connections here, and then the information goes out to, this is a flashlight, and this is your visible and IR laser. What I thought was interesting here was the zeroing turrets on the white light illumination actually do work. So if we turn this, and I continue to turn this, you can kind of see that that turret and erector assembly is going up. And then if I turn it the other way, it goes down. So it's just kind of interesting that they use the actual turrets inside of here, even though they don't actually connect up to anything. Now we can kind of see how that assembly works on the laser side. And so these are these recessed screws. And so you can see the zeroing turrets push the arm, which then swivels the diodes inside the housing. And that basically is how you get your zero. On the other side, there's this little spring, and that just keeps constant tension so that arm is pushed up against the turrets. What I'm doing right now is just gonna take out the PCB just so you can see what it looks like on the other side. This will be more interesting on the potted version. In here, you can see, obviously it's not potted, but you can see the clicker right there for the top button, and then the potentiometer selector for your different modes. So after taking this unit apart, I have some conclusions about what I think about this unit. First and foremost, the crane plug going out and not being able to utilize a remote switch, that's pretty much unrepairable. You cannot avoid that situation. If that happens to you, you basically have to tear apart the unit like I done here in order to resolder that connection. So that's just a no-go. The other thing is, with this specific housing, I did notice a difference in kind of its strength and durability as compared to the potted version up here. This older housing, I believe that they've updated, don't quote me here, but I believe that they updated the housings, because this one feels a little bit different, and just doing a quick scratch test as well, it felt like it had a little bit more nylon in it versus the glass fiber reinforcement. But this housing is extremely brittle. It's very thin down in here, right where the claw grabs. You could easily poke a hole with a screwdriver, and this thing just kind of crumbles apart in your hand. So from a housing perspective, the actual L3 spec for the actual PEQ15 is to go finger tight and then do a quarter turn to tighten, and that's it. Definitely a little bit of user error on my part, so I'll admit to that. However, this older housing definitely is not able to stand up to impacts because it is very brittle. That being said, in terms of an airsoft PEQ15, this would never get mounted on a real rifle. In terms of an airsoft PEQ15, I do find it hard to recommend this for $75, especially because this connector here can break very easily. The other thing that I wanted to mention here as well, kind of the assembly, is the way that the battery connection works is just this raw copper wire making loose connection with the brass terminal here, and that's it. So I'll talk about this in the other PEQ15 that's disassembled up there, but just know that this became a failure mode for that one and rendered the unit inoperable. So overall, I don't know if I can really recommend these for use, even for airsoft, let alone real steel. That being said, we do have another unit, a newer unit. So this is with their updated housing. I'll run this for a couple of days and just kind of see if this holds up. But so far, not looking too hot. I definitely want to like these units as a airsoft replica that's actually functional and eye safe. Some of the replicas that I've seen are functional, but they're definitely not eye safe, and I would not recommend you use it on a force on force because you can cause damage to people's eyes. These definitely can output more than eye safe level, and they are not really regulated. So what is next for this particular unit? The repairs that I'm going to be making, SomoGear already kind of did it on their potted unit. They increased the amount of wiring that goes to this brass shell here. So I'm gonna solder on an additional piece of wire and kind of wrap it around here. I'm then also going to epoxy this wire in place in order to just make sure that it does not become a failure mode like it did on the other unit. Resolder on this connection, epoxy this whole assembly in place as well. And then basically on this side, going to pack in some epoxy putty in order to reinforce this section, sandwich the whole thing down to try to add some rigidity back into this claw mount, because the housing is the mount for the actual unit. Gonna try to pack this full of epoxy, see what happens, and then basically follow the L3 instructions of finger tight and then a quarter turn, and then hopefully this should be able to hold zero, maintain it, but we'll test that out later. So we'll get this unit out of the way, and then I'm gonna pull the potted SomoGear PEQ15 out, and we'll take a look. So similar to the non-potted version, I'll talk about disassembly first, and basically kind of similar operation here. What I was able to do is, again, take those drill bits, was able to remove the epoxy from these 3 screws, as well as the screw up front. Each one of the screws here was actually a 5/64 Allen, except for this one. I believe this was a Phillips head, but what I ended up doing was drilling too deep, and I ended up stripping out that Phillips head, so I actually had to drill the Phillips head out and then extract the screw. So luckily I was able to get that out. But basically the replacement screws here, it looks like it's using Imperial screws, but an M3 does fit, so we'll just be using those because those are what I had on hand. I'm not quite sure what size screw this is, but it does look like it might be Imperial, so just a heads up there. And then again, similar to the non-potted version, there was very, very little sealant or glue around the edges. So again, I suspect that water ingress will be an issue with this unit, if that's something that you care about. So taking a look at the actual construction of the unit, as I kind of alluded to in the other part, the failure mode specifically for this unit was just that this piece of copper wire that connects up to the battery terminal broke off. And so basically the repair I'm going to make to the other unit is to take a similar piece of copper wire, solder it on, and then loop it around to give it more of a connection point. In this one, I'll just reconnect this copper wire, do what SomoGear did, except what I'll do is try to epoxy this down so that way this weak point right here between the copper wire and the housing, that doesn't become a vibration point, which can easily snap or work harden this piece of copper. Now, taking a look at the construction, what's interesting about the battery terminal is that there is basically no adhesive holding this in place, and what they're relying on are these little protrusions on the cylinder in order to kind of just stop it against the actual PCB. Just kind of odd to me as to why they would do that, but I suspect that little bit of jiggling and wiggling is what ended up work hardening that little strand of copper, broke it off, and then basically rendered this whole thing completely useless. In terms of the life, kind of what did this go through? I had this on my rifle for about 2,000 rounds. And at about the 2,000 round mark, as well as we have 3 other units that all went to about 2,000 rounds. All of them broke in some way or fashion. differing issues there. But right around 2,000 rounds, all of the units broke. So just keep that in mind if you do buy one of these things. I'm not quite sure if they're really made to last without major modifications. But that's pretty much it for this unit here. I tested this connection. Everything works fine. Crane port works fine. Similar to what I'm going to do on the non-potted version. I'm going to basically epoxy coat this piece right here. Try to stay away from these turrets. Epoxy coat the battery terminal there. And then as we can see, the assembly here on the IR illuminator and the Zero is very similar. And we can see how those turrets kind of work in action. One other thing I'm noticing just now actually too is that there is no basically sealant or glue around the edges of these turrets. So I suspect that's another place where water ingress could be an issue. So if we take a look at the PCB here on this one, we'll pull this out and kind of turn it to the side. So this is the potting that they talk about. You can kind of see it. Try to get in closer. You can see that clear epoxy that's placed over the components on the control board. We can see the way that the button is mounted here. So instead of it being directly on the board, it is underneath this cover here. And then same with the potentiometer. That's separate as well. And so what I'll try to do is probably place some additional epoxy around these components and the turrets in order to get a little bit better of a seal, just to kind of weatherproof this a little bit more, and then reassemble, check Zero, and see if it can hold up for another 2,000 rounds. Again, with what I kind of talked about in the other unit is basically this got rendered inoperable at the end of the day because of a battery connection issue. You would have to, in order to repair that, you need to tear this thing down, do everything that I've done, and then have to basically apply repairs. If you're okay with doing that, this might be a good solution for you. But if that's not something that you're capable of doing or want to do or feel like needs to happen, there is technically a warranty with these units, but that warranty is 1 year. And frankly speaking, I don't know that a lot of people get out and shoot that much where they'll actually put 2,000 rounds through one of these PEQs for it to fail within that year and get a warranty replacement and continue to do that process. So I would just be careful of the reviews that you're hearing if they're not in the high round count with some of these units. Just be wary if this is something that you want to continue to use and train with. Personally, because I was able to tear this thing down, I think it should be fine once we add some additional epoxy within the internals, but I definitely would not recommend somebody buying this off the shelf, sticking it on their gun, and calling it good. I would save up a bit more money and try to get something that's a little bit better than what SomoGear currently offers. I also have some additional items that we purchased from SomoGear, namely being their Axon clone. Immediately, again, hey, 200-pound gorilla in the room, monkeying on this stuff and ended up breaking it. So I actually ended up cracking the mount in multiple places. So as you can see here, it's cracked here at the bolts, and pretty much every single point on here, it's cracked. I have a real Axon mount here and claw. We can kind of compare the two. So the real unit, as you can see, is actually smaller than the SomoGear version. Also, the claw is not interchangeable, so I can't actually repair this, and it will no longer stay on the rifle. So again, SomoGear strikes again. Fool me once, fool me twice, fool me thrice. That's on me at this point. But personally, I'm basically done with SomoGear. I'll get these units repaired. I'll show them functioning and working. But at this point, I do not recommend anybody purchase any more SomoGear items, not even for airsoft. And that's what really grinds my gears, is this was potentially a very good airsoft offering. that could be really good for the community, but it's just not there. It breaks very easily. It's not something that you can rely on game after game. I know people tear up their equipment. We run it hard. And this isn't even something that I would put on an airsoft rifle at this point. So what is next? Got the units back up and running. So we can see here, we've got the green laser back up. And then on the other unit, we also have the red laser back on. And this more or less kind of holds up to the rail, even though the entire body's cracked. And this one we'll be taking out on the range this weekend and get this zeroed in, see if it holds zero still. But basically, there's going to be no more updates around these SomoGears. I'm going to repair a couple of other units that we had within the group, see how those kind of hold up. But if you hear nothing else from the SomoGear saga, then kind of assume either they got thrown away or they're working just fine. But won't be covering these anymore on the channel. However, I am looking at some additional laser aiming modules. SMS laser is a pretty cheap one, 250, 280 bucks depending on where you get it. Laser Speed, M6TR, those are coming out with a V-Cell version. Z-Bolt is coming out with their own LAM as well. And Hollow Sun with the Iris. So now is really a good time to be in the laser aiming module game. There's been a ton of advancement in the last couple of years here, so what I'll say is just don't spend your money on one of these SomoGears. Either wait for something else to come out, check out reviews, those sorts of things, but I would not give the SomoGear another dime, personally, even for airsoft. That being said, hey, if you found this video helpful or insightful in any way, go ahead and give it a like, a thumbs up, and consider subscribing. I know I've been kind of AWOL for the last year and a half roughly, but there's a lot of big plans in 2025 to really get after it, do some more force on force training. Been really focused on the real steel for the last year, but getting back into airsoft, getting back into milsims, those sorts of things. So you'll see more on the channel, and appreciate you guys watching. Till next time, catch you on the field.